So looking forward to our session now this afternoon, Understanding Justice. This will be a unique and engaging panel discussion. We're going to be hearing perspectives on what it is for justice to be done or not done in two very distinct spheres. First, the core communities of Saskatoon. We'll be hearing from MCC's valued community partner, Straight Up. And then we'll be hearing from the blockades of Wet'suwet'en territory from MCC's valued church partner, Mennonite Church Saskatchewan, or Mennonite Church Canada, rather. In these two discussions, we're going to be listening for consistent and contrasting concepts around the tensions between law and justice. We'll be thinking about redemptive and transformative justice and considering what our responses might be, how we can engage. So how the session will work is that we're going to hear first from our friends at Straight Up, and they'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we'll hear from our friends at Mennonite Church Canada for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we'll have time for all of us to share our questions and comments with the panel. Like the morning plenary, you can submit your question or comment by sending me, the moderator, a direct message in the chat. And feel free to do this at any point in time during the presentations. And then I'll be putting your questions and comments to our panelists at the end. So let's get started. I'll start by introducing our friends from Straight Up, and then after they present, I'll introduce our friends from Mennonite Church Canada. So Stan Tui, as he's known in the community, has been working with youth and adults involved in the criminal justice system for the last 18 years. Stan is married and is the father of 4 beautiful girls. Currently, Stan works as a school social worker at Askayak High School and is the co-founder of Straight Up. I've known Stan for probably over 10 years from community justice work we've been able to connect on. And just meeting for the first time Tori Bowman. Welcome, Tori. Tori is from Atakakoop First Nation. Tori recently was released from a federal institution. Since her release, she has been focusing on being a mother to her 2 beautiful boys, aged 10 and 7, and putting in personal work required to maintain her sobriety. A quote that currently describes where Tori is at is, "And the chaos within her found balance." Such an honor to have both of you share with us today.
All right, thank you for the warm introductions. I'm assuming we could start now? Okay, right on.
Take it away.
Okay, right on. As Amanda mentioned, you know, I've been fortunate. I was going through the participants and I recognized a lot of names that I've worked with over the years. And there's also a lot of names that I'm not familiar with. So how I kind of wanted to start it off was I wanted to share, just because we have limited time, I might be going fast, but if you have questions, please be prepared to write it down and ask during the panel. But I wanted to share kind of like the history of Straight Up, how Straight Up came to be. Before I start, approximately 20 years ago, 2 active gang members approached an individual named Father Andre. Now, Father Andre was a chaplain at the Saskatoon Correctional Center. And when they approached him, they essentially said, you know what, we're tired of living the gang lifestyle. We're tired of not being there for our kids. We want to quit, but we don't know how. And approximately 20 years ago, no one was working with active gang members. No one actually knew what to do. And so Father Andre, you know, looked at these 2 individuals and said, hey, you know what, I've never worked with gang members before. I don't know how the process works, but let's kind of learn together. So through that evolution of 20 years, you know, Straight Up kind of through trial and error, developed its own approaches in working with individuals. And so that's and I kind of met Father Andre about 16 years ago when I was working with youth. And through our interactions, we kind of started working together and eventually Straight Up was formed. So that's kind of like a little snapshot history of Straight Up. One of the things I like to acknowledge as well is how the name Straight Up came to be. And so for those that might be unfamiliar, Straight Up is spelled STR, has a number 8, and then UP. And when Father Andre and I were working with individuals who were wanting to leave the gangs, they would often ask us, well, what's your guys' names? What are we going to call you guys? And we're very grassroots, right? And so we thought of some names. We were like, okay, what should we call ourselves? Anti-gang strategy. We didn't like that name. And there was this individual that one day wrote Father Andre. He was at the Saskatoon Correctional Center. And he wrote him a letter. And as Father Andre was reading the letter, this individual signed off, much love, straight up, right? And we're like, hey, straight up, that's kind of catchy, And so we approached the individual, and when he was in the correctional center, he said, hey, we really like this straight up. Do you think we could use it as a name? And that individual agreed. And so that's kind of how the name came to be, straight up. So, all right. For my piece of the presentation, I'll attempt to answer the following 2 questions. How might justice be redemptive or transformative? And what does it look like when justice is done or finished? Before I kind of go into those 2 questions, I want to share kind of my experience right now working with individuals involved in the justice system. And so my experience and the stories that I hear is that often times their first interaction with police, yes, they've committed some sort of crime, but their interactions with police when they're arrested, on how they're talked to or treated, is often traumatic for them. So that's their first interaction. As they go through the court process, rightly or wrongly, when I say this, I just want to make sure they feel that because legal aid lawyers are so overworked, they feel that oftentimes when they go to court, they meet their lawyers for the first time at court, right? So oftentimes they wish that they had a court-appointed lawyer, because in their perception, they have at least talked to that lawyer 2 or 3 times before they arrive at court. And that's a very generalization, okay? I just want to point that out, just the experience of the individuals that I kind of work with. And while they're waiting on remand, because they're on remand, they don't have access to programming, okay? So they're not dealing with the core issue of why they're being arrested in the first place. And the other layer that has to fit with this is, because individuals I work with are identified as gang members in the system, they're often in secure custody, locked up 23.5 hours a day, 7 days a week, or they're in a gang range, right? And so think of you being in a gang range where if you're trying to leave that, but that's what everyone is around, talks about, thinks about, right? And then the other kind of, extra layer on top of that is COVID. COVID has added stress to inmates because family visits were canceled. Yard time, the opportunity for them to go into the community, not into the community, go into like outside, was canceled. Community supports like myself and others on this line that do this type of work weren't able to go into the jails, and they weren't able to have family visits. And those that were immunocompromised were terrified, because if you think of COVID and what they say, closed space, not very clean, people were scared. And so that's kind of my reality as of today of the individuals that I work with. Okay, I just wanted to kind of paint that picture, because that kind of leads to that question, how might justice be redemptive or transformative? So when I was thinking of the word redemptive, and we kind of joke, we call it Elder Google. Elder Google knows everything, right? And so Google defines redemptive as acting to save someone from error or evil, and defines transformative as causing or able to cause an important or lasting change in someone. And, my belief is that for us to save someone from error and to have that person experience a lasting change, a couple of things need to occur. And I just need to kind of point out, straight up, that language of save is not something that we use, because we're not in the business of saving people, I guess. But, to correct someone from error and to have that behavior kind of transform, as I mentioned, I feel like it kind of has two areas. And as I was thinking about this, I don't think this is in any particular order, but, first goes to us who are outside of the justice system. I think that we have to view inmates in the justice system as, if we view inmates in the justice system as wounded or hurting individuals, instead of having an attitude of viewing inmates as bad people, because when we see inmates as bad people, we react accordingly, and we won't be able to support them as they go through the justice system, right? If we believe that inmates are hurting individuals, then we have a paradigm shift, that transformative, right? We have that paradigm shift where we could say as a community, hey, this individual's hurting. We could actually help them heal. And so if we could help individuals heal, that's a whole different type of mindset of looking at individuals that are bad, because we can't do anything with bad people. And so when we look at people as bad people, then that's how the justice system, I believe, tends to be more punitive versus being therapeutic, right? If we see individuals as hurting, then these individuals, like I mentioned, are healing. That allows for therapeutic type of approaches. I think so. That's the one shift as a community. The second is the individual who commits a crime must understand the seriousness of that crime, and hopefully they share that seriousness with the victim, right? There's not, when you think of our court systems, there's not those opportunities where the offender and the victim could get together, right? And this same individuals must also develop a relationship with their new lifestyle, which I'm going to state in the conditions and goals of Straight Up. And so what I wanted to do is on this chat there, I'm going to post. I know it's on privately, but I'm not sure who controls it. But if they could kind of have everyone read it, because this is the type of work that in the practical sense of how we do our work in Straight Up, in making the justice system redemptive and therapeutic. And so when we talk about the goals and conditions of Straight Up, we're asking individuals that like when Tori reached out and was interested in Straight Up, we ask her, write an autobiography of yourself, share a little bit about who you are. And the reason we do that is when you think of individuals who go through the justice system, the Crown prosecutors and stuff, they read files on this individual of someone else who wrote their opinion about that individual. And so when we ask for an autobiography, we're saying to Tori, share with us what you're comfortable with, and that's our starting point as our relationship grows. And as trust grows, then we'll get to know each other more. And then we kind of shared with her the goals and conditions of Straight Up, and I'm just going to go by them pretty quickly. Think of it as these are practical steps in how the offender, when they're healthy, they want to give back to the community. And so, they have to drop their colors, they have to deal with their addictions, they have to be honest, be humble, be willing to commit to Straight Up for 4 years. And 4 is more of a symbolic number to show that healing takes time. And I think that's unique because someone could be sentenced for 2 years, 10 years, but it doesn't mean healing has occurred, right? Through that process. So we're asking for that commitment of really working on yourself. And, oftentimes we say to individuals, here's the things that we want you to work on, but the end goal that we want individuals to be is, be a loving parent. As Tori mentioned, as Amanda mentioned that was read, Tori's focused on being a loving mom to her kids, making that reconnection, being a faithful partner, and being a responsible citizen. So Straight Up firmly believes that the process of working with individuals as they strive to commit to the conditions and goals is based on relationships. We must be willing to walk and support or assist individuals as they learn to become a responsible citizen. And I think in this part of the heading question, I would like to say that no transformation, no redemption is possible without relationships. That's key, right? How can the justice system be redemptive or transformative when the focus is not on relationships? And so going to the next heading, what does it look like when justice is done or finished? For me, how it looks like is that the individual is living the goals and conditions of straight up. You know, they're giving back to the community they have taken so much, as I mentioned. But in order for that to happen, we as a community must have, I feel we need to be involved in developing the resources for those individuals to access, right, as they come out. Because a lot of individuals, in my experience, I would say all individuals, I'm not saying some or most, I would say all individuals really want to do well, right? But because of the lack of resources or whatever it might be, they kind of feel trapped and they kind of go back into that dysfunctional cycle that they find themselves in. And as I mentioned, as a community, our attitudes are transformed to view people who are struggling as hurting rather than as a bad person. And one of the sayings that we have within Straight Up that hopefully, I guess, captures what I was saying is that when we work with individuals, we're not in front to lead them. We're not behind pushing them, but we're beside them, walking side by side. So if they, you know what, if they fall in the sense of relapsing or making mistakes, that's okay. We'll wait for them to pick themselves up and continue on. And so that's kind of my piece of the presentation. I'm going to turn over to Tori and go from there.
Hi, I'm Tori. I was raised with both my parents in my life. I'm the oldest daughter out of, I believe, 9 of us. I was suffering from a lot of grief and loss growing up. I lost my children's father 6 years ago, and that's kind of where it started off. And all the other losses I had growing up too, like lost my best friend, my little sister, and my other little sister and my baby brother. They're all just kids too, so I still think about like how life would be with them. But now that I have all the skills that I learned in jail and how to cope with all the depression and the grief and the loss, and I'm able to just accept things as is, and you know, God's putting me through this, so He knows that I can handle it. You know, yeah, I got picked up a year ago and I got 2 years, and I did my time in the healing lodge. From when I first, like me being in the justice system, at first I didn't really care. Like I was like real trouble. They used to call me in jail, like the guards. And yeah, I was still an active gang member when I first went to jail. That was like 4 years ago now. And yeah, I was in SEG the whole time when I first got my first sentence. So I didn't really get anything from jail that time. I wasn't working on myself, didn't really know how to like control my anger, control my feelings. And when the last time I went to jail, well, what I'm in jail for right now, or like what I'm doing my sentence for, I wasn't going to settle for staying in Pine Grove because I didn't want to just go to jail and waste a whole 18 months for something that I did while I was drunk or anything. And I just really wanted to change my life at the time too, because I was tired of being on the streets, and I wanted to go home to my kids. And yeah, I didn't want nothing else but a federal sentence. And they sent me to the healing lodge, Okamauchi Healing Lodge. And yeah, at first I wasn't I was still in the mindset where I was like, okay, I'm just going to go in and do my time and get out and go back to whatever I was doing. And then I had a couple more losses in jail. And what really opened my eyes is like one of my best friends died when I was in jail, and he was only out for a month. And yeah, like he was an active gang member and he was trying to leave and everything. And he was murdered in PA. But yeah, that's like what really opened my eyes, because like I grew up with him, and like yeah, I knew like if I wasn't gonna smarten up, I would have ended up the same way too, you know? And yeah, I started putting a lot of effort into all my programs. I started doing one-on-one sessions with a social worker in there, and I worked on boundaries and grief and loss, and I did all my programs, and I really learned how to ground myself with like singing and drumming. So like being able to learn my 7 sacred teachings and all these things, all these coping skills and everything and like making me realize what I was doing was actually still really wrong, you know, like living in the streets and that, and like things that I was letting go of, and I didn't have no morals or didn't really care about what was gonna happen to me. So all the programs in there like made me realize like I didn't even have to do most of that stuff to be happy. I didn't even I wasn't even happy. It was just all because I was not in the right state of mind, I guess. And yeah, the justice system did change me though, because I learned to be more grateful, more patient. Going to the healing lodge, and some of my fears today are going back to that lifestyle, and even trying it just once, because I know if I try it just once, I'm just going to go off and think that I could get away with it all the time. And I know I'm not going to get away with it. Like, it makes me realize that I have to stay on my best behavior just to get home to my kids. And like things are happening so fast, and I'm so grateful for everything that I'm going through nowadays, because if I was in that state of mind I was a year ago, who knows, maybe I would never even been here. Just that is my fear, is like me losing it all, because I'd be throwing a lot of stuff away that I put on the table, you know, and all my opportunities would be going down the drain just because me being afraid to talk or anything. I know the best thing for me to do is reach out to all my supports that I have and gained. And yeah.
All right. Now, if we were in an audience there, I don't see any clapping hands on the screen here for Zoom, but we would clap the hands here for Tori Matt. That was actually her first presentation ever. So, you know, I'm pretty proud of her. Takes a lot to kind of open up, especially going back to our theme, especially in an environment where it teaches you to be closed, right? In an environment where it teaches you to wear certain masks. And in order to wear those masks, you know, you have to kind of wear them to kind of, you feel to survive. But when we talked about transformative and redemptive, we're saying, you know, you're going to have to learn to trust people. You're going to have to learn to take those masks off in order to heal. And so she's come a long ways, Tori. So I'll leave it at that and allow the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan, and thank you, Tori. I hope you saw the clapping hands and the clapping hands emojis that everyone had up on their screens. It was awesome to see, and we're just so thankful to you, Tori, for the courage and your vulnerability and sharing. Thank you so much, and we want to hold your story with the honor that it deserves, and thank you so much for that. Stan, thank you for, as always, sharing the wisdom of your experience and such a crucial reframe around people who are criminalized. Instead of seeing them as bad, seeing them as hurting. And that really just changes everything going forward, like you're saying. And so we're so thankful for that, as well as speaking to transformation happening through relationship, which I think resonates with many of us. I just want to continue encouraging people to send me in the chat any questions or comments that you have that you'd want to put to our panelists. And again, you want to send a message to moderator for that. So now I'm pleased to introduce our two remaining panelists for the session, our friends from Mennonite Church Canada. First, Steve Heinrichs. Steve Heinrichs is a settler Christian who grew up on the West Coast and has lived in Winnipeg for the last 10 years. The Director of Indigenous Settler Relations for Mennonite Church Canada, Steve does decolonizing education and networking by day and activism and organizing by night. In response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Steve has edited a few books on the roles and responsibilities of the church, including Unsettling the Word, Biblical Experiments in Decolonization. And joining Steve on the panel is Allegra Friesen-Epp, who I'll introduce and then she'll speak after Steve. Allegra is an intern with Mennonite Church Canada's Indigenous Settler Relations Office, and she's also working with Christian Peacemaker Teams, their Turtle Island Solidarity Network. Allegra's work consists of advocacy, community organizing, church engagement, and on-the-ground accompaniment. Allegra recently spent 2 months in Wet'suwet'en Territory at the invasion of the Benestoten land defenders. She has a degree in Biblical and Theological Studies from Canadian Mennonite University. Allegra lives on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, where she attends Home Street Mennonite Church. Welcome to both of you. We're delighted to have you here. Steve was a speaker at our first Peace Conference 2 years ago on advocacy, and so we're really glad to have you back speaking at our conference. And Allegra, welcome to you. Looking forward to hearing from both of you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And thank you to the circle that's gathered here for this, such important conversations. And I want to lift my heart to Stan and Tori. I so appreciated the way you went about sharing with such gentleness and humility. It's just beautiful. So thank you for that. So I'm speaking from paper. It does come from my heart, but it is a text that I've written here. And I've titled my presentation, Indigenous Blockades and Divine Interventions. And it goes like this. In the winter of 2020, just before COVID hit, Canada was shut down by a series of Indigenous blockades. Blockades that were erected in response to the RCMP's violent invasion of Wet'suwet'en Territory. The police, on behalf of the state, had arrested Native land defenders, elders, and allies who were trying to stop a fracked gas pipeline that threatens Wet'suwet'en lands and waters, but also our common home. Blockades, both hard and soft, went up on highways in northern BC, on rail lines in Manitoba and Ontario, and on bridges in Prince Edward Island. Many Canadians decried the disruption of these protests and demanded the enforcement of the rule of law. Many religious communities, genuinely supportive of Indigenous rights and reconciliation, were conflicted. This tactic, the blockade, it's not something most are comfortable with. It looks and feels like a path toward conflict creation and escalation, not resolution. Couldn't we resolve this through more dialogue, asked many? What about mediation and negotiation? Blockades create tension. There's no doubt about it. But can they foster justice and the restoration of relations? Well, that was 2020. And this past month in Wet'suwet'en territory, as Coastal GasLink prepared to drill under the Wet'suwet'en River, land defenders evicted the pipeline corporation by physically reoccupying that part of their territory. To protect their sacred headwaters, they erected another blockade and effectively stopped the project. What will happen in the weeks ahead? We're not sure. But this is big, and it's nothing new in these lands many of us call Canada. You all know about Fairy Creek, right? Happening right now in 1492 Landback Lane from this past year. You know about Caledonia, 2006, and Grassy Narrows, 2003. You know about Ipperwash, 1995, Oka, 1990, and Haida Gwaii, 1985. Canada's history of Indigenous blockades goes back far, back to the beginning. As people of faith, where, we ask, is Creator in all this? How might we think about Indigenous occupations and blockades in relationship to justice and the restoration of peoples and nations? And perhaps most importantly, where might we stand when the next blockade goes up? It was September 1995. I was 19 years old, sitting in my parents' living room late one evening, listening to my uncles and aunts talk as they sat around the table playing canasta and drinking Ryan 7. The conversation was animated. Who do those natives think they are? They've got to get on with the times. It just isn't fair what the natives, are doing to that farmer. September 95 was the time of the Gustafson Lake standoff, a month-long conflict that took place in Secwepemc territory near 100 Mile House in central British Columbia. First Nations Sundancers had reoccupied a traditional ceremonial ground that was located on a local rancher's private land. The RCMP, they intervened, and on September 11th, they surrounded the camp and a firefight erupted. It's said to be the largest paramilitary operation in BC's history. And thank God no one lost a life. Two of the camp spokespersons, Wolverine and Splitting the Sky, said that they were willing to pay a great cost for the land, willing to die. Die. According to their lawyer, Janice Switlow, there have been only two ways in which the government has dealt with Aboriginal peoples who refuse to leave their land, either by payoff or by murder. Both are contrary, said Switlow, to the honor of the Crown, the justice of the Crown. Wolverine and Splitting the Sky were not prepared to become sellouts and betray their beliefs and their Creator. Back in my parents' living room, the conversation continues hot. From the vantage of my relatives, what the natives are doing is not just and not restorative. But why is that? Listening closely, it becomes plain. It's because the rancher owns the title to the property. No one mentions how the title was usurped from the natives. It's because whites really made this country and brought civilization to the savages. Though no one uses the words whites or savages because whites are invisible and savages, well, that's just impolite. It's because the natives had little or nothing before we came around, and without us, they'd just be a thing of the past. So what is just and fair when you see the world like that? In the end, might makes right and justice too. It was January 2007. I was in Palestine, serving with Christian peacemaker teams, A Jewish activist and myself had been accompanying a United Nations tanker truck that was trying to bring potable drinking water to a Palestinian village that had none. No water because the illegal Jewish settlement that was built next to the Palestinian village on the village's land had cut off all their water supplies. But when we tried to bring the water, which is a basic human right under international law, we were met with a blockade, a Jewish blockade. Settlers had parked cars all across the road leading into the village, and the Israeli army was there supporting the settlers' action with the force of arms. Now, from the vantage of the settlers, this blockade of a life-sustaining resource was perfectly just. How so? Their rationale was not unlike what I heard in my parents' living room. The native Palestinians don't have legitimate title to these lands. God has decreed these territories of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria as the settlers call it, to be the possession of the Jews. Or with more sophistication, these lands were terra nullius, largely empty and unused. The settlers had a right to these lands because they were, quote, making the desert bloom. A storyline not unlike one hears in Canada about the settling of the prairies. And yet, from the vantage of the Palestinians and of international law, the Jewish settlements that are being built and expanded all across that West Bank, they have, quote, no legal validity. A blockade preventing access to clean drinking water. Sounds hauntingly familiar in a Canadian context where so many Native communities still lack drinking water because of Canadian policy blockades. It's a heart-rending indignity. Their land is stolen, and they can't even get the basics, the very minimum standards to survive. In March 2020, I arrived in Wet'suwet'en territory one day after the hereditary chiefs had finished 3 days of title and land talks with representatives of the Crown. They would sign an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, in which Canada recognized that, quote, rights and title are held by the Wet'suwet'en houses under their system of governance. A few weeks earlier, Indigenous blockades in Wet'suwet'en and in Dandenega, Mohawk territory, and elsewhere, they had been dismantled by the RCMP with much violence and numerous arrests. I was there in Wet'suwet'en territory as a legal observer, monitoring the activities of the Coastal GasLink Corporation and the police. There was no Indigenous blockades at this time. And with no blockade, the fossil fuel company drove into Native territory every day from 5 a.m. in the morning till 10 at night, wholly unabated, digging up Wet'suwet'en land for their resource project. But get this, they weren't alone. They were chaperoned by RCMP vehicles at every turn. Now, whose justice and whose rights, we must ask, are being protected in this situation? Like many white Canadians, I grew up believing that the RCMP served a mediating presence. But seeing the police chaperoning convoys of Coastal GasLink vehicles, some 50 to 70 trucks a day, just shattered that idea. The RCMP were the muscles behind this corporation's claim that they had a right to this land. They were the muscles behind Canada's assertion to radical title and ultimate sovereignty. Of course, the RCMP weren't armed to the teeth as they were when they dismantled the blockades, and they were often smiling and friendly, and I have no doubt that they are good people. Yet in truth, this system was still violent, the structure. This was the routine violence that Canadian settler colonialism is built on, that of enforced dispossession. It's the everyday violence that Indigenous blockades are trying to stop and undo, and thus bring about a measure of justice that can lead toward right relations. All right, I'll close these. I'm a preacher at heart. I'm going to close these reflections on blockades with a biblical story. In Mark 11, we see Jesus enacting a temporary blockade in Jerusalem. Quote, he entered the temple and drove out those who were selling and buying. He overturned the tables of the money changers, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Like Indigenous land defenders, our Lord Jesus was not content with the dominant economics that surrounded him. Economics that crushed the poor and landless and benefited the elite. Economics that were rationalized, sanctified, and buttressed by religion. And so he disrupted business as usual, employing a tactic that we privileged church people, if we're really honest, deeply question. This is provocative. This is conflict creation, not conflict resolution. In fact, Jesus probably knew that his action would bring about further resistance and possibly his death. And yet Jesus chose the blockade. He stopped traffic and embodied an embargo at great cost because he knew it was right. Now, maybe not the right thing, but certainly a right thing. The sovereign economic claims of the political and religious establishment needed to be challenged for the sake of the poor, if not for the poor's actual freedom and liberation, at least for their dignity. Indigenous land defenders, like Jesus, from my experience, are realistic. Though they know their blockades will often meet with resistance and the force of arms, the blockades still go up. And they will still go up because the tables of Canada's dominant system are unjust and need to be overturned or even slowed down so folks can breathe, because so many just can't breathe. The blockades will go up because the poor and landless must be heard, must be seen, at least for dignity's sake, even if it costs them. Yes, even their life. Over to my colleague, Allegra.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screens in just a moment. Can everyone see this? Yeah, awesome. Okay. Still hear some overlap in what I'm going to share with some of Steve's experiences, but I want to reflect particularly on the time that I spent in Wet'suwet'en territory this past fall. It was on September 30th, this new national holiday of truth and reconciliation, that I had the chance to visit Coyote Camp. Now, Coyote Camp was established by one of the Wet'suwet'en clans in northern BC. And it was established because, as Steve mentioned, the Coastal GasLink pipeline company is preparing to drill under the Wet'suwet'en, a river that is sacred to the Wet'suwet'en people and integral to their way of life. The water of the Wet'suwet'en is pristine. You can cup your hands and drink straight out of it. The river is prime salmon habitat. It nourishes the bears, the deer, the lynx, the bald eagles, and so many other animal relatives in the area. Now, just for some context, all of 5 Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have said no to all pipelines in their territory. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled 24 years ago that Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs hold rights and title over their ancestral lands, and that they must be consulted prior to the implementation of resource extraction projects on their territory. And yet, today at Coyote Camp, the Gidimt'en people and their supporters are being interrogated by the police, often on a daily basis. And just a week prior to September 30th, Coastal GasLink had bulldozed an archaeological site belonging to the Gidimt'en without their consent, without an archaeologist present. A few days later, 2 people were arrested for non-violently occupying the territory. The RCMP used a taser on one and what they called pain compliance on the other. So on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, community members, allies, chiefs, and people from neighboring clans were joining arms at Coyote Camp. And they were gathering to honor children who had been lost to residential schools. And so I watched as the chiefs were drummed into a circle and they welcomed us to their territory. They spoke from the heart about what these lands mean to them, about the pain that their people continue to carry, about the strength and determination within their communities. And then we held 2 minutes and 15 seconds of silence. That was to remember all children who were found in Kamloops and all children who never returned home from residential schools. And then this was followed by a song, which was led by the women. And it was a song of mourning, mourning for the children and mourning for the ravaged earth. It was at Coyote Camp that I began to understand the interconnectedness between lost children and lost land. See, the Wet'suwet'en need a land base in order to raise their children. They need to be able to exercise their jurisdiction, their traditional practices of hunting and trapping, of picking berries and medicines. So many of their children have been taken away from them, removed from the land, removed from Wet'suwet'en ways of life. And now Wet'suwet'en, the sacred river and life source of their future generations, is under threat. I want to share a short video with you that centers the voice of Slato. Slato is the mother of 3, and she's the spokesperson at Coyote Camp.
Children to protect still. There was nothing that anybody could do at that time when the police came to take the children away. When the Indian agents came with the RCMP to remove children from their home territories, we couldn't do anything. But we can do something now. We're powerful people. The Wet'suwet'en people have always been a powerful people. Along with our Giksan allies, we stood together for thousands of years to protect our territories. And we're doing the same now, and we have been for years, in order to defend our land for our children, so that they never have to experience what the children from residential schools experienced. We have the power to put a stop to all of it if we stand together and we use our warrior spirits to stand up to the state violence and be powerful.
When I think back to my time at Wet'suwet'en, I think about what it means to stand up to state violence. I think about blockades that have been erected not just to keep Coastal GasLink out, but to create spaces of healing. Blockades that have been established not out of anger, but out of compassion. Compassion for the earth, the waters, the river, compassion for the children, compassion for those downstream of the pipeline, compassion for future generations. I hadn't realized that blockades could be redemptive spaces. One of the main features of the camp I was staying at in Wet'suwet'en is a healing center. This center is the site of youth camps, counseling, language teaching, and culturally safe healing programs. It's a place for land-based learning and living. And healing here takes place on Indigenous terms, according to Indigenous understandings and practices of wellness. The slogan of the camp is "Heal the people, heal the land." The Wet'suwet'en people know that their own well-being is integrally linked to the well-being of the earth. And so they haven't just said no to pipelines. They've said yes to the flourishing of their territory. They've said yes to a clean river. I hadn't realized that resistance camps could be places of healing. Being at Wet'suwet'en has enhanced my understanding of restorative justice. I saw justice that was restoring people to their own lands. I saw justice that was restoring Mother Earth herself. The Wet'suwet'en are seeking justice through the healing of their communities. One of the things Coastal GasLink does is tie pink tape to trees to indicate where they will clear cut a path for the pipeline. And the Wet'suwet'en, they hang red dresses from trees to honor and remember murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The RCMP have slashed people's car tires at Coyote Camp, ravaged through people's tents, and drained their cisterns of drinking water. The Gidimt'en people, they've draped orange shirts and Wet'suwet'en flags over Coastal GasLink construction equipment. As a person committed to peace, I have been challenged to identify where the violence really lies. I've been challenged beyond the question of why the blockade, and instead to consider the oppressive circumstances and conditions that lead people to establish blockades in the first place. I have been invited to experience the healing and hope that flows out of resistance camps in Wet'suwet'en territory. I have witnessed the power of people, as Slato says, using their warrior spirits to stand up to state violence. I want to end by returning to the folks at Coyote Camp and listening to the words of Chief Was.
Helkwa. The river is still there, which is still there. The mountains are still there. But look at the damage. Look at how far it goes. Going back to our ancestors, there was a lot of activity going on around here because the river is right here. They put up their houses, they put up their homes. There were many of us here long time ago. Hundreds of thousands of us here. All the animals were still here. And now look at it. And yet still, we have a cabin back here. It's still back here. It went back onto the land. CGL divided us. CGL lied to us. They didn't consult with us. And they said they were going to drill under this river from this point on. And that won't happen. We're not going to let that happen. To those that are investing into this, you must look at this. That's the type of industry you're investing in. They are killing us to this day. To those who are saying yes to this, you must look at this. You must look at how it's impacting us, Wet'suwet'en people out here. We're not just living on reserves. We never did. We're out here hunting. We're out here doing our trapping. We're out here doing our fishing. We're out here coexisting with the animals. That's who we are, Wet'suwet'en people. Our grandchildren will stay here. Our grandchildren will see what we've done. Our grandchildren will see our mark here. And they will see why we saved this river.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allegra and Steve, for sharing, from heart, mind, and spirit about your solidarity and the justice work that you do. We've got some compelling questions coming in through the chat, and maybe the first one is to put to the four of you. What links did you see to one another's stories? I mean, we purposely invited stories to this panel of justice or experiences of injustice in different spheres, and yet we see some consistent themes, and wondering what you thought of one another sharing and what links that you see between the problems of justice you're facing, the responses to that injustice, and the redemptive possibilities. And feel free to just unmute yourself and share whatever you'd like.
I can jump in there and just share one thought that comes to mind. And I think it's very much a growing edge for myself. But I heard both Stan and Allegra talk about justice as healing. And this is like we need therapy. There's a compassionate posture that's trying to bring about care and healing for people and land. And so I love the way that Allegra kind of helps reframe it. It's like, I need that kind of reframing as well. It's like these, they're not just saying no to certain, violent projects that are taking place that are causing harm to land, but they're saying yes to so much more than all of that. So thinking about Stan and Tori's posture, just reframing it from a place of, the prison system being one that historically has been one of punishment and retribution, but needing to move more and more to a space of healing and therapy. If we could reimagine these interventions that Indigenous peoples are offering up in our non-Indigenous Canadian mindset, and saying they're putting up something to call us to healing, to protect something. I think it's a major shift in thought in both realms. Check.
Yeah, I think, for me, when I was listening to Steve, he made a comment there that I never really thought of. He said policy blockade, right? I think if I was to quote him, and you know, in the work that I do, we always hear like, you know, there's barriers. We use words like barriers, but I've just never thought of policies that prevent people as a form of blockade, right? So that was kind of very interesting that when we create a justice system that doesn't look at individuals as human beings and doesn't sometimes have their best interest, that in a sense is a blockade. Those policies are blockades. And I guess I just never made that connection until he had mentioned that.
So good. Thank you both. One question that's also tying into both of your presentations is, what does it mean to bring restorative justice when the abusers are arms of the state or powerful state-supported interests? And what does it mean to bring healing to the people organizing those abuses?
That's a really interesting question. And I think one way I would answer is that like we are all being called, whether we're a CGL worker or an RCMP officer or a settler Christian, we're all being called to listen to the invitations of Indigenous land defenders and water protectors right now. And you know, the CGL trucks, the Coastal GasLink trucks, drive past Unistoten camp where I was staying day in and day out. They know that a camp is there. And my wish for them is that they would take a bit of time to learn about the people there and what's happening there. I think there would be a lot of healing with that. The folks at camp would say, oh, they just think that we're eco-terrorists. They have no idea what we're doing. And I think if folks within the pipeline company, within the RCMP, if they would listen, I think there would be a lot of healing and reparations that would come with that as well. And an invitation really to join arms, I think. In the struggle to defend, in words Steve likes to use, our common home, right? The river, the lands, the waters that we all depend upon.
Stan and Tori, I wonder how you would respond to that same question about criminal justice system actors, and how what would it mean to bring healing to them, like police officers, correctional officers, so on, in terms of the violence of the system.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to turn it over to Tori here and see what her thoughts are. You know, I kind of was sharing with her when was, how do you kind of work within a system that naturally the inmates and the guards, if I was to use, is us versus them, right? And so I'll just kind of, you know, turn it over here to Tori here, share her thoughts. How does she work within the system? She's still in, right? She's still in this system as she's trying to leave a system so she could continue on her life.
At Hokamauchi Hilanaja, they don't like us being like inmates calling them inmates or the guards being called guards. They're older brothers and older sisters, and we were residents. When I was at Okamauchi, I had a hard time like even talking to them because I was so worried about that. But then like as time went on and I really put that focus on trying to better myself, I gained a lot of relationships in the system where it really shocked them because I wasn't the type to even talk to anybody about it. So like I didn't really care what anybody thought. I just wanted to work on myself, and I cherished all those relationships I have with social workers or CXs or guards. Yeah.
Transformation through relationship. Yeah. That's a theme of your comments. It's awesome. Well, there's many of us here in the room who volunteer in restorative justice organizations or want to engage more in working alongside folks. And so I just put to the panel, like, what is the role and posture of allies in your work, and how would you encourage the people here today or guide us to be stronger allies and to be contributing to the transformative justice that you're describing?
Well, I'll say something that I think is just probably obvious to everybody in the circle, but that call to listen and to learn one's story. I think both of Stan naming how the courts often don't actually hear the story of the people who are coming before those spaces and how critical that is. And Allegra shared how if only the Coastal GasLink company and the RCMP had time to learn the actual stories. Now, I think that's complicated. I think the structures will really inhibit people from, even if they did know the stories, not just following through on what their mandates, and honestly, they're on the payroll, right? But hearing one's genuinely listening to another's story I think is just the critical first step. And that leads to the comments that were made around justice begins with relationships, like restoration begins with relationships. So it's truly listening with one's heart and being able to receive vulnerable sharing like we did this afternoon with one's heart.
Tori has some enlightening words here.
It was good.
So what advice would you give to people who want to work with inmates? From your experience.
The advice I'd give is just to listen and show that you believe in them, because like I think that's what really got the best of me, was like everybody I gained those relationships with all believed in that I'd be a better person by the time I finished my sentence.
Thank you all for sharing and for giving us all hope that from the wounds of deep violence there can be healing for those wounds, and that there can be a redemptive arc coming from the pain of injustice. And thank you so much, all of you, for sharing. And I'll ask all of us if we could have our Zoom applause in our squares for the panelists. Thank you all so much for giving of yourself.